You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech leaders and experts and observers. I'm Josh Schimmer, one of those observers, joined today by Tess Cameron, Eric Schmidt, and Sam Fazeli. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. And any commentary about biotech stocks should not be construed as investment advice because we all know how difficult and tricky a field it can be to navigate. But with that said, the XBI is ripping. It's up 2 octaves higher in a month. It's gone from the 130 to 140 range, now up into the middle of the 150 to 160 range. So I guess we'll kick off with this question. Are we getting ahead of ourselves? Is this all a response to some expectation that the FDA is going to be highly permissive for new drug approvals, or is something else going on? Who wants to take a shot at that?
Eric.
Of course.
Okay, I'll start, guys. Chime in. It's funny, as Sam just mentioned, I was through Europe this week, and there was a lot of trepidation that we're getting ahead of ourselves. Almost every meeting I had started with just that question: isn't this a little bit too far, too fast for the XBR? And we get ahead of ourselves. And I don't know. To me, it feels like that's coming from a background of PTSD, right? We were beaten for so long. And so glass half empty, that when things are as good as they are right now, and I think it's almost a perfect storm in terms of the fundamentals coming together here. Josh, you mentioned the FDA. Certainly it's going to be permissive in the near term. M&A, I know we're going to talk about that on this show. The macro environment, low interest rates, innovation being as good as it's ever been. No, I think we ought to sit back and enjoy it. What I don't see that you typically see at a frothy market is signs of lack of differentiation, right? Everything going up at once. And we've still got names that we can talk about today that are down, 20, 25% on the week. So it's still a good stock pickers market and still a great time for biotech. But I'll keep it to that and let the others chime in.
Something that we like to be anchored to when we look at biotech valuations is we look at pharma free cash flows and we say, how many years of pharma free cash flows would it take to acquire like all mid-cap biotech? That's kind of our equivalent, I guess, of like the, an EV to sales ratio or something like that, that you might look at for, revenue generating sectors. But when we look at that metric, like, look, 2020 was really high, right? And when we look at the years of free cash flow to acquire all mid-cap biotechs, it was like over 5 years of free cash flow from strategics. Today, we're sitting at like a bit under, I think bit under 4. So it's not that out of the realm of reasonable. 2025 was around 3.5 times, 2026 3.7 times. So at least the growth that we're seeing in biotech is certainly supported by the growth that we are seeing in pharma free cash flows. So that's just one point to kind of add here. And I think a second one is we have to remember the change in XBI composition, right? So you could look at this and just kind of go back to history and say like, well, in 2020 wasn't the number really high, and we were looking at a peak of just south of 170, and now we're at 155. But the composition for the XBI did change pretty substantially, with weighting towards bigger companies with pretty strong fundamentals. So I think that's important to kind of take into account as well.
Oh, fascinating. Sam, what's your take?
Yeah, Josh, I mean, look, pretty much every indicator you look at is positive for the sector. So, the FDA issues are behind us, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit. M&A is doing well. Public market is back open despite AI, some days at least doing really well. So tech sector. I think the only thing that I hear from people is that they're not just worried about where XBI is going back to the PTSD, which I think is a very, very astute comment. But also, they're also having to worry about what happens if this AI, I'm not going to call it a bubble, a lot of people do use that phrase, bursts. That's the one that I think a lot of people are also scared of, and that wasn't necessarily always the case. It wasn't, as the biotech was doing really well, it wasn't another sector that they thought could drag them down if that enormous bubble, if you want to call it that, bursts. So, over.
It's so interesting. I mean, Tess, especially the way that you framed it around years of pharma cash flow to acquire the entire sector. And I guess what I would argue is that framework, historically kind of had to be in place because the only way to get capital out of the sector was with M&A because, most of the companies weren't even profitable. On average, biotech was unprofitable. But now that we're in a new era, we actually do have the potential to create profitable biotech companies, diversified biotech companies, and instead of selling off some of our best companies with the best prospects to pharma, if we could keep that revenue and cash flow generating power within the XBI, it would draw in more generalists, seeing a sector that was very attractively valued on a fundamental basis, not on a hopes and dreams, not on a multiple of revenue, et cetera, on a real fundamental basis. And that kind of cash flow would be incredibly powerful for the entire sector, probably dwarfing what one could accomplish through M&A. So I'm kind of curious how others see the evolving role of pharma M&A for biotech and the extent to which, it's great in the moment, getting a 2x return on a stock overnight. But are we compromising the opportunity to create tremendous long-term value for the sector if we kept these companies independent longer and instead of selling to pharma, sold to other biotech?
Josh, you've always
Well, and
you've
Josh,
always been a bit worried about this. I mean, this is, and I think, do you have a choice here though? Is there something you can do to prevent it?
Fair?
well, I'm just going to chime in on Josh's behalf here. Look at RevMed, right? I mean, people were cheering when, I guess early this year, the stock was at 80, and there was rumor that Merck was going to buy them for maybe a whopping 50% premium, around 120. And something happened. We don't know, Sam, if it was the RevMed board that turned it down or what, but there was no deal. And today, the stock's hitting new highs at 180. So I know that's a short-term phenomena, and certainly the final chapter has yet to be written. But so far, kudos to those guys.
No, I'm not arguing against it. It's just that I don't know what power we have to prevent it, apart from telling boards and shareholders not to accept these deals. On the other hand, I completely agree. I mean, the people who came into that latest fundraising for RevMed have told me they're looking at a future, in their view, Vertex. You look at that multiple on sales now, look at where this is going, and you can see. And that would be it's a very strong win. Over.
Yeah, yeah, maybe just adding, right? I think I think Josh, you've emphasized a lot the importance of biotech being a business, right? And executives, biotech executives really building for their companies to be businesses and ultimately be able to grow to profitability. And it is great to have other companies like now, RevMed in the sector that like can be future acquirers. I mean, remember the anxiety, when Celgene, disappeared and became a part of, BMS, and they had been such an engine, for collaborations and acquisitions, within the ecosystem. So I think, definitely good to have multiple, business models that can work, and I think can help give boards and companies confidence to commercialize independently when they see great peers who've been able to achieve the same. And would love to see more of those. But I know we're about to jump into one example of a company where I guess the offer from pharma was just too too attractive to resist. So I think that's going to continue to happen. And the more pharma sees companies actually creating a lot of value in the commercial space, probably the more the more it becomes important to try and place those bets, before a company has commercialized and made decisions around things like pricing and contracting.
Yeah, do you want to continue with that with that update, the Apogee acquisition?
Yeah, absolutely. Word started, coming out over the weekend about AbbVie, potentially making a bid for Apogee, and indeed we saw that come to fruition. So almost $11 billion, 10.9 10.9 billion buyout for the company. And what Apogee is focused on. So they have a half-life extended IL-13 antibody, zumilokibart, that is currently in development with atopic dermatitis as the lead, and this is being positioned as a potential better Dupixent, right, which is an IL-4 antibody. And I think I think this is the first, I know many people on this call will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first of, the companies that have really been focused on like taking a known target, really, optimizing the antibody and, building in half-life extension to create potentially better molecules. Fairmount, founded company, huge congratulations to them on this deal. And I think there had maybe been some skepticism in the market previously about just this approach, right? And hey, is half-life extension going to be enough to be really interesting for strategics to want to jump in, right? Especially in this case, we do have Dupixent that has lots of exclusivity for atopic dermatitis, at least, in 2031. And so I think this acquisition, kind of clearly, demonstrates AbbVie's, talking about this as an over $10 billion, peak sales drug, and, clearly reinforces that when you have these, half-life extensions that can lead to a potentially differentiated profile, that's certainly very interesting for strategics.
Was anyone else surprised that, given all the competitive dynamics coming out of China, AbbVie decided to pay as much as they did for Apogee as opposed to finding something cheaper? And does anyone think that that may reflect some growing concerns that the U.S. may block, or the U.S. government may block funds into China assets?
I don't know if.
Well, it sounds like
Sorry, ahead. Go ahead, Eric.
no, Sam, please.
No, just go ahead.
Well, I want Josh to kind of flesh out his view a little bit further. It sounds like he's got this concern, and I don't know if that's just something that is from the top of his head, or whether we should all be more worried than I am right now about this.
I don't know. We had our bus tour. Our colleague Eric Watsek hosted, and I was fortunate enough to be able to join it. It's just so impressive in terms of how much innovation's happening there, how high quality, how fast, and most importantly, how cheap. Right. So I guess companies have to decide, right? Like maybe you're a little bit behind if you're bringing an asset out of China, but on the other hand, the purchase price is quite small. Obviously, there's power to them having the first mover advantage, but how important is that, and what is the trend going to be over time as China increasingly becomes the source of high quality, fast to market, or fast to development, I should say, innovation?
Well, let me comment on a couple things here, right? Because the call that AbbVie had was informative for like why this asset, right? Why, Apogee overdoing something that's potentially earlier, but cheaper coming out of China. And I think a few things to point out, right? One is that AbbVie did talk about like the part B of the of the Apogee trial being consistent with what a global trial would look like, right? And just they talked about balance of patients, balance of countries, sites. And so that kind of speaks to replicability, right? And how important or how value creating replicable data can be, right? And then I think another point here is, they talked about sales starting in 2030, right? When we think about the Dupixent timeline and, 2031 for atopic derm for Dupixent, that positioning like a year may be worth a lot there, right? Because you're talking about, potentially coming into a market where, formularies may have changed versus like, formularies kind of leading with like well, not leading with a branded agent, here, but, having that branded agent, be the first kind of biologic that someone may see, right? Rather than having to go through a biosimilar. So they did talk about wanting to position Zumi as first line, right? And I think that is, a reason where time and replicability of data can just be worth like a lot here, right? And I think that, I know we'll talk about China more here in a minute, but I think that kind of speaks to like, no matter where an asset kind of comes from, if it's, something that's, comes out of initially discovered in the US or initially, discovered in China, a lot of that kind of value creation, comes down the road while you're building that data set that can be highly replicable and really thinking about, order of entry. Order of entry really matters, right? Order of entry, especially for markets that are heavily, contracting driven, that order of entry really matters, and strategics are willing to pay a lot for that.
Coming back to M&A as a driver of biotech, I guess I ran a quick regression analysis looking at XBI performance versus biopharma M&A over the last 5 or 6 years. There's like almost no correlation. It's like an R squared of 0.2. So I didn't slice and dice the data more precisely to figure out if there are clear trends of XBI performance correlating with M&A, but everyone kind of talks about M&A being a major driver of XBI performance. Does anyone really have strong data that proves that to be the case?
No. Did you do deal volume or deal value?
Well,
Sorry, just
deal,
to be a pain.
I did deal value.
Yeah, so you would have thought deal value would be, if anything's going to correlate, would be deal value, because that's the money going back in the sector, supposedly, right?
In theory, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day,
I mean, to Tess's point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
Josh.
go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
Well, I was going to just iterate around a comment that Tess made earlier around pharma cash flows and the ability to use that cash flow to acquire a major chunk of our industry. I mean, what would our industry be like if we didn't have M&A? I mean, generally speaking, we've been very fortunate to have, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and $100 billion worth of deals each year in, year out, all at a very substantial premium to where stocks trade in the public markets, right? So if we were to X that out, if we were to take out $75 billion a year, I get that there are some years it's a little higher, some years a little bit lower, and that there's no direct correlation as you showed us earlier today, Josh. It would still be a very, very meaningful premium dollar amount that came out of our industry, right? A 40, 50% premium on $75 billion is $20 or $25 billion that would be lit on fire that we otherwise don't get access to as biotech investors. So I don't want to think about that. Just because there's not a direct, maybe year in, year out correlation doesn't mean that the M&A is not very, very, very important to our sector. There aren't too many sectors that benefit from this kind of big brother eating little brother phenomenon, which is so.
Well, if you add up the value of biotech companies, depending on how you kind of define it, all the way up to Vertex and Regeneron, it now sums to about 1.4 trillion. So does 100 billion in M&A, and half of that is premium, really moved the needle on the sector. Again, relative to what obviously generalists can do, we see the generalists coming in. That's why the sector is now in the $1 trillion plus kind of range. Interesting debate, but maybe we are so far off the script, but I know everyone here is so adaptable to all the questions, but maybe we can kind of press on with another one of the China assets spin-out updates. We had a couple of them this week. Serapha, if I'm pronouncing that right, and I think, Sam, you were going to take that, obviously relevant for Tess and NRA Capital, and then Tess is going to take Ollin in the China
yes.
spin-out.
So Tess, correct me if I get any of this wrong. Certainly not on the name, because Serapha, I'm going to call it, right? So this is a new co. The Chinese call them new co, right? With a twist. And I have to say, it's a hell of a transaction to pull together, because they formed the company, and I think at the same time or very shortly beforehand, there's no date on it. They in-licensed the key asset, which is, I'm looking for my notes here, YOLT 202, which they've now called SERP-01 for AATD. So they've brought that in and then reversed into a company Bolt, which is obviously Boundless Bio. So there's some maneuvering there. I don't know how that tango was all organized, but and the first thing I assumed was to go and see whether there was an obvious shareholding by RA and RTW, who are the key leads on the Serapha $230 million raise on the Bold investor list, and I couldn't find them. RA was there. RA got out by the look of it sometime in the first half this year. So the only link I could find, which of course I think these things do need a link, was the connection between RTW and Jonathan Lim, who is the chairman of Boundless Bio, which is one of the few biotechs in the US. I haven't done the maths. I don't know how many biotechs there are like that, where the CEO chairman are not the same. He's the chairman, and he, of course, he is also the founder of Araska, if I'm not totally off there. And RA had a position there, so clearly they know, or RTW had a position there. They clearly know each other. Maybe that's what helped the link the assets here together. And of course, the common area again is that Araska is also based on at least one of the assets of a China-based asset. So Boundless agrees to have Serapha reverse into it. Serapha raises $138 million in a Series A plus $92 million to come and close a deal, co-led by RA Capital and RTW, and a bunch of other luminaries in the biotech sector: Eventide, Beliasny, Lifesci, Casdin, Vivo, etc. Janus. So with the Boundless cash, I love that. I wish everybody had Boundless cash.
Boundless cash. If only every company had boundless cash.
With the cash that's coming in, although they're making a dividend to their shareholders of around $40 million or so, the companies suggested they have enough money to get to the second half of 2029 to finish phase 2 and start phase 3. And what is this drug? Well, it's an investigational in vivo base editing therapy for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And of course, that technology was based on what Yoltech has, and Yoltech is a China-based biotech, and they have plenty of other assets, etc. So very interesting deal, very interesting structure. And I wonder if Tess can or would like to add any color to it, any further.
I think you summarized it super well.
Oh, well, there you go. So
Tess,
yeah.
as I said, maybe Tess can cover all in, and then we can keep this conversation going, because there's a little bit of a interesting Twitter battle going on.
Indeed. So Josh, do you want to summarize the Twitter battle?
Well, why don't you do all in first and summarize that? Because I think
Great.
they pair interestingly well.
They do. Yeah. So I think another one, another financing that got announced this week was an Ollin, Ollin Biosciences, which is a $330 million Series B. And this was to advance phase 3 development for OLN 324 in, DME and wet AMD. So coming up with a competitor here for Eylea, which is, exciting. RA Capital, we were in this, along with a number of other, number of other investors, Blackstone, A16Z, Commodore, Canadian Pension Plan. And this was a company that was founded back in, launched in 2023 by Arch Venture Partners together with Mubadala Capital and Monograph Capital, with a really interesting set of assets, including OLN 324, which was really highlighted, in the PR, as well as another medicine that was in license for Graves' disease. And I think in terms of where these came from, the Graves' disease drugs was in license from a company called Velavigo in China, and the 324 had demonstrated, data in China as well. I don't actually have a record of which. Oh no, Innovent, of course, is the innovator behind OLN 324. So I think another example of, a few assets that kind of came from China innovators, have presumably, continued to, look strong in the clinic and really led to very meaningful financing to move forward in phase 3 development and maybe make one of those other big biotech companies, Josh, that you've talked about that can really bring things forward on their own.
Yeah, I haven't seen the the back of the eye data for the Ollin product, but having followed the wet AMD space now for almost 20 years, you just have to be so careful in terms of how you interpret, particularly the OCT images and looking for baseline imbalances. But I know at least the data is reported to say that the efficacy may be better than Vabysmo, which would be really an important differentiating profile. But these deals triggered a little bit of a Twitter Titan spat with Arch's Bob Nelson suggesting that maybe Serapha was kind of just a copycat of Beam, and why do we need that type of innovation? Peter Kolchinsky kind of responding, saying that there's some data to still come out, so let's wait and see what that shows before we just call it a Me Too. And then someone else chimed in and kind of said, "Well, hold on, Bob, what's Olin? I mean, isn't that a little bit of a Me Too as well?" And of course, the same counterpoint is, well, no, it's actually potentially quite differentiated. But I guess that with some of the rumblings in Washington around deal flow coming out of China, and I know this is something, Tess, that Peter's been very vocal about. Do we have any general expectations in terms of how this might evolve? There was some news this week about the U.S. government presenting to the Bio Board about playing offense and defense versus China. Any thoughts as to what the future may hold?
Hard to know, right? I think there have been, a few articles about, various meetings related to the Coins Act, which does restrict U.S. investment and particularly U.S. knowledge transfer to AI and robotics and a number of other kind of dual use sectors, right? Biotech is a different, it's a different story in terms of, the potential, the potential for, military applications, right? They're certainly there, right? But can kind of regular way biotech business, really enable that? I think is we're looking at a different situation than in AI and robotics, where maybe those applications can be more closely linked. So, definitely still discussion ongoing on that. I am not, smart enough to, have a prediction or forecast, for this administration, other than to say, I think there is an understanding that these are, that there's important differences between these sectors. We always make the distinction, and Peter and I wrote in our article about why, a ban on China would really be self-defeating for the U.S. We need to make a distinction between physical supply chains and innovation supply chains, where physical supply chain, gotta really, protect national interests there and make sure that supply of drug is something that, could be maintained in any type of conflict. Innovation supply chains, right? That's based on patents. Like patents are out there, right? So, the more that we, kind of reinforce that ecosystem, the more we're all, kind of relying on patents as the source of value, and the more that we, the more that innovation is kind of visible, and available in a conflict situation. So I think that's a really key difference here that needs to be, considered. And then on the what should the U.S. be doing? Well, it's great to see all the, it's great to see the IND pilot come out from the FDA, and fantastic to see a lot of energy and focus on, what can we do to really, keep the US competitive and incentivize, early discovery and innovation here.
So along these lines, if you look at the private financings year to date that are north of 100 million, I haven't crunched the numbers yet, but it's clear that a growing proportion of them are kind of these China asset hunting spin out transactions. Go to China, find a couple of assets, build a company around it, financing it, for north of 100, sometimes hundreds of millions. And there has been some criticism that we're not diverting efforts and funding, whether it's investors or whether it's pharma, to U.S. based innovation. So is this trend pulling too much capital away from U.S. original innovation as we're kind of pursuing these, validated, low cost, incrementally beneficial medicines out of China?
So I think you got to look at the numbers really closely, right? And some people kind of cite the numbers in terms of like overall out licensing deals, right? Where, my gosh, 2025, like 136 billion of out licensing deals from China in 2025. But we have to put that number in context, right? Like, what of that is upfronts? Well, it's about 5.6 billion in upfronts in 2025. So, like 136 billion, that's not the right number to be looking at. Like, we've got to look at, the upfronts. And then when we consider those upfronts relative to like the acquisition of one company, Apogee, 10.9 billion, right? It's like, all right, like I think we can see where value creation is accruing, right? And that is the US market. And I think actually examples like Ollin, like Serapha actually show why the US market, is likely going to remain the center of gravity for biotech value creation, which is because the end market is the US, right? You need to study in a US patient population. You want your phase 3 design, ideally like your phase 2 design. You want to show that like, these medicines are going to work. We talked about, AbbVie's comments on how, Apogee's, part B of the trial was, gave them a lot of confidence and replicability. So, that I think that's a really important point to emphasize why, a lot of that value creation is likely going to stay here, right? More incentives, more that allows, U.S. biotech to, especially on the early side, really, really continue to compete and do well is important. But I think the kind of flow of dollars from here to there, like I don't think that's really true when you actually, look at the numbers and consider the probability adjustment on those, future out licensing payments. Even just
Tess,
looking at the total, sorry, I just have one more point that's kind of important here, but even just looking at the total amount of out licensing activity, we looked at, the US for the past, 5 years or so, and, the ex-China value of out licensing deals has stayed around like 140 to 160 billion since 2021. And then you just see this like spike start coming up in 2024, 2025 with a lot more of these China deals. But that ex-China out licensing activity that hasn't really diminished. It's kind of sat around that 140 to 160 billion level.
so Tess, if this tap was shut, if you were told tomorrow you're not allowed to somehow, by some mechanism, bring in any assets from China to start a company in the US, so now you do that. Um, what would that suddenly mean that you have an extra $5 billion or whatever in your bank that you're going to now hunt US deals? Because that's the ultimate aim here, right?
Well, look, I mean, I think that's a good question, Sam, of like, what is the ultimate aim? And is the ultimate aim really national security, as people say, or is it, US profits? I think there's a lot of reason why, US profits, US value creation will actually stay here, whether, the seeds for that are coming from the US or China. But yeah, I mean, if the idea is like, hey, can we just, kind of keep capital at home and not let it leave the US if you want to invest in biotech, What happens? Well, I think what happens kind of near term is like, hey, maybe there's a bit more that's hanging around the US. Is that all going to flow to early stuff? No, right? Like that's going to flow across multiple stages wherever there's the most, the highest opportunity for like absolute returns. A key kind of consideration there is like, it's not like you don't have to think about China anymore if, US companies can't just outbound and go to China. You still have to think about China, right? Because like, hey, like China drugs can still go through a lot of other places and come into the US, right? Like there's nothing that I've
Mm.
seen that is proposing an actual ban on like a drug that
It
is
just that
ideated
that
in
that
China can
just
come
does
to,
it just doesn't make sense. Anyway, I think we could go
yes.
on forever
I
about
mean, the
this.
point.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
ultimately, a compression of returns in biotech is just going to mean less money for biotech, right? I think we all know that. So, let's hope that people are kind of thinking through that game theory as they consider some of these policies.
this conversation to me sounds like we're arguing about the weather or something like that. Nobody can control this, right? The innovation is going to find its way to the markets, and the capital is going to find its way to the innovation. So whether or not Bob Nelson and Peter Kolchinsky view something as innovative or non-innovative, it doesn't matter. Over time, innovation will rise to the top. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we had 20 companies going after CD19 CAR Ts, and that was too many. And many people who invested in quote that innovation at the time lost a lot of money and closed shop and went elsewhere, right? So that wasn't an innovative enough thing to do, and the market decided that those companies that were still pursuing that lack of innovation were not going to be rewarded. I think the same thing's going on here. It's a global economy. Very, very hard, I think, for anyone to determine, no matter where they sit or who they are, that innovation should or shouldn't be funded. It's going to get funded.
Speaking of hard to predict aspects of innovation, let's go to oncology. Sam, you're going to talk about an update from Pfizer and their ADC platform they acquired with Seagen.
Yeah, I'm not going to dwell too much on this given the time and how many more other topics we have. So they had a trial fail, which was in second line monotherapy trial with a drug called sigvotatug vedotin, so SIGV, which is an integrin beta 6 targeting ADC, which came from the Seagen stable. Now that was in second line monotherapy going up against docetaxel. So when you looked at the phase 2 data, we couldn't see a very strong reason for why this should work. And in phase 3, it failed. What is interesting, of course, is that when you look at the combination with Keytruda, remember these vedotin type drugs. Now, obviously, that's a Nectin-4 vedotin ADC in bladder, muscle invasive bladder, with Keytruda has been super successful. So here, what would be interesting to see whether this combination in first line combined with Keytruda is going to give us better data. Two things: the data that we've seen so far, phase 1, does suggest there's a good synergy there. And the other thing is that in the press release, they say when we look at the 2/3 of patients with only one line of therapy, so not more advanced, there does seem to be a better trend in OS. Now, I don't know whether it's going to end up being data dredging or not, but there's a phase 3 ongoing anyway. So we'll find out the reason for that. And don't forget that Pfizer raised a couple of eyebrows when they did a deal with Innovent a while back with a meaningful sized upfront, which included some ADCs. So the folks were going, well, why are you doing this? Didn't you just acquire an ADC company? Which of course is not a relevant point because things evolve. And that's what, if Innovent's got something more interesting with their different linkers, then that's what you do. Over.
So this week was the Bio conference in San Diego, right in my backyard. And Mike King, our good friend, was scheduled to be on a panel talking about investing in oncology. He wasn't able to join. So of all the people, he asked me to fill in, which is kind of ironic because Eric and I often debate how investable oncology is in general, and I'm often taking the kind of the more pessimistic approach. Oncology is so hard because preclinical data doesn't effectively translate into response rates, which doesn't effectively translate into PFS, which doesn't effectively translate into overall survival. You also wind up in like just really intense competitive dynamics, and it makes it more speculative and really hard to to pick the winners with any degree of confidence. I think I probably left that audience a little bit more depressed than I had intended. I mean, obviously, oncology innovation is incredibly important and also incredibly successful on whole. But when it comes to picking specific companies, I find it very challenging. I'm super selective. Eric and I often debate like, do you need to be all in on oncology or can you dabble a little bit? Sam, I know you spend a lot of time in this space. I'd love to kind of get your views around, really feeling confident getting ahead of potential updates or outcomes in this space.
Yeah, I mean, look, Josh, I hear everything you're saying from the translation from preclinical models. That's very fair. What is a positive with oncology is that you can go into phase one pretty much into patients, and you can get a much more meaningful outcome or data set. Now, again, you did say that response rates don't always translate to PFS. It certainly is the case in some tumors, but not all tumors. So, but at the end of the day, it is a tough space to be in, and you've got to when you're pushing up against the tail of the curve with Keytruda and you want to raise that by 10%, that's a pretty hefty ask if you're trying to engage the immune system to do better than it was doing before with just Keytruda. And yet, whoever does that will be a big winner because we know these drugs can sell big. So, and that is the story of biotech. I mean, I could throw back at you that we shouldn't be doing that. CNS is continues to be a difficult space, and yet so many companies spend effort into it. So I think oncology is I'm hearing that there is maybe a resurgence of interest. I mean, you look at what VCs have been doing, it doesn't show anything like a resurgence of anything. It's the opposite, right? Investment's been going down, number of deals been going down. And the first half of this year, I think we had, for the first time, far fewer oncology deals than we had non-oncology deals in terms of Series A, et cetera. So that's the story. But I'm hearing from some of my friends who are, like you guys, on the sell side, doing IPOs and looking at some of these things, that there may be a resurgence. I don't know what Eric and Tess think of this. Over.
Well, I think you guys are discussing maybe two different things, Sam. You were talking about how, from an investment standpoint, the returns can be quite substantial because you de-risk things quite early. You have premium pricing. You have a lot of unmet need. You have these blockbuster markets, and you have M&A. I think even today, oncology is the number one subsector for M&A, and it's been that for the last 5 years, as Josh knows. But Josh, on the other hand, was suggesting that from our standpoint as investors, it's hard to get an edge. It's hard to get an angle. It's hard to get conviction. It's hard to beat our investor competition. And I don't know. I guess I feel a little bit differently, or maybe I'm still too pig-headed to admit that, I can't be any bit better than the pack at this. I do think that the models have gotten a lot better. Yes, Josh, you got to roll up your sleeves and really understand the clinical data. Certainly the genomic mechanistic rationale for certain targets is superior to others. And again, I think it takes a ton of work. And I don't think anyone should dabble in the space. But in some ways, it's the most molecular of industries that we have, right? Everything comes down to clear, discrete molecular pathways. And I think a lot of it is increasingly predictable. So we'll see how things play out. But I think it's going to get easier, not harder.
Why don't we move to some of the FDA updates? Specifically, Regenxbio has resubmitted its Hunter BLA application for its gene therapy. Replicor is now on the slate for an AdCom, and PDUFA date for its oncolytic virus in the third quarter. Where do we feel like we're at now with the FDA? And Tess, I think you're also going to talk about an RBC capital market report on FDA Commissioner candidates to the extent that that'll influence the outcome of FDA permissiveness going forward.
So Josh, my answer is a very short one, so I'll just give it. I think we are very close to normality. That's it. We seem to be getting our outcomes back. We seem to be walking back the 1 year of waste that we had. The flu vaccine from Moderna, Regenxbio. There was the melanoma product from the company's name that I forget. But it's going back to normal. Bring your drug, we'll assess it properly, and we'll tell you what we think. Not make somebody at the very top decide that they don't like it. And the same, obviously, with Huntington's cure, right? Over.
Yeah, exactly. Tess?
Yeah, I think maybe just one of the big questions outstanding is obviously who is going to be the next commissioner, and who are the potential contenders here. And RBC came out with a report, looking at candidates, and they highlighted the increased comfort around the FDA. Talked about Replimune resubmitting. We just talked about Regenix, resubmitting. Oculus alignment on single trial filing. And they put forward an analysis on the kind of current set of who they understand to be the current top set of candidates, which are Heidi Overton, John Crowley, Stephen Ferreira, Norm Sharpless, Richard Pops, and Kyle Diamantas. And it was an interesting report, right? That shows that we there's obviously a range of options on who the commissioner could be, and we're not looking at one kind of unique stance behind these individuals. They talked about they talked about both Heidi and Kyle as likely currently likely, depending on a lot of the direction from RFK and and Maha agenda, with Crowley, Ferreira, as Crowley, Ferreira, Sharpless, and Pops as a set of candidates that's likely going to be quite constructive with industry, has a lot of industry background. Some of those folks, Pops and Crowley in particular, coming with industry backgrounds, likely subject to very high scrutiny around conflict of interest. So I think those are the things that kind of stood out to me, is that there's still I think we're, there's Vinay Prasad is not on the list, right? So, there's a certain amount of, maybe, more, maybe trying to not, bring the FDA kind of closer to, what we have been used to as normal, for many years before, before 2025. I think all the candidates probably, bring us back in that direction, but still a pretty, broad, broad aperture in terms of what the FDA could look like.
Great. Do you want to cover the German pricing update and
Oh yeah,
US
just
pushback?
very quickly. I think we can cover this quickly. I mean, look, it's been interesting to see all the back and forth on pricing plans for Europe. We had tariffs last year. We had MFN come out end of last year, and I think a lot of European governments have been kind of wrestling with how to think about these policies. Germany came out with a policy in April where they said, that, hey, we're going to use drug pricing to close a funding gap in our budget. And, hey, if you make more revenue as a drug, guess what? We're going to, cut the price more. And, depending on what revenue threshold you make and the impact that would have had, I think we can all, forecast would be, essentially to make Germany a substantially less attractive market for launching medicines, which when you combine with MFN is really a real kind of puts that market at a real detriment. We saw Lilly announce that they were going to reduce investment in Germany, and then USTR came out in June 18th saying that they were going to open an investigation under Section 301 into those pricing policies. And the word this week was that maybe Germany is going to back off. So we'll have to see where that goes. I'm not sure if anyone else here has more insights.
No, there.
I wouldn't,
That's
but Eric's in Germany, so maybe he can go and do some channel checks for us. No, but let me just add one little bit here in that I obviously live in Europe, not in Germany, but in France and the UK. So I see this issue all the time. As a group, we're looking at what Europe needs to spend to retain some semblance of sovereignty when it comes to tech, AI, defense, energy, industrials, and the numbers are eye-watering. So the problem I think the region as a whole is going to have, is how do you balance that need for investing and defending yourself against some adversary with defense and the needing to keep your folks healthy? That's the tough part. And I think I don't want to be in these politicians' shoes to make these decisions. But I tell you, that is I think the background source of this issue. Over.
Why don't we move to some other industry news? Sadly, it looks like the end of the road for Sangamo, one of the remaining class of 2000 biotech IPOs filed for bankruptcy protection, not necessarily bankruptcy, selling off its assets. They have a couple of stalking horse bids for the platform and assets from Eli Lilly and Astellas. I didn't realize it's called stalking horse bids because hunters often hide behind a horse as they're stalking their prey, right? So in theory, there are other companies that are kind of hiding behind Lilly and Astellas, waiting for them to make their first move before coming in and potentially bidding higher. Typically, there will be a breakup fee, though, for those first mover asset bidders and buyers. In other news, Aris Pharma got a little clobbered this week with the announcement that Neffy was not added to the formulary of an important PBM for July 1st ahead of the back-to-school season, Neffy being a nasal epinephrine to replace things like the EpiPen. What I didn't realize was that for negotiating access to formularies with PBMs, oftentimes smaller companies such as ARS can't talk to the company directly. And so they have to use kind of a third party negotiator who negotiates on behalf of a group of smaller companies and smaller assets in a very opaque type system. So a little bit confusing there, also a little bit frustrating that smaller companies just can't get into important PBMs to get products on formulary a little bit faster. That was kind of a nuance I had not appreciated. We got an update from Moderna. Now they're Science Day, moving their mRNA platform in all sorts of directions, T-cell engagers, in vivo CAR T. Sam, what's your take on that?
So don't forget, Josh, very quickly here, given time, that they've got a new science head of R&D, David Berman, who came from Immunocore and then many years at large pharma before that. So the things that I found quite interesting is, as you and I discussed offline, why do you need T-cell engagers produced by mRNA? What advantage does that give you? In fact, another thing that I didn't quite understand is how they get away from or not having to prove the contribution of components when you have like 3 mRNAs. And one of the ones they're moving forward with is actually one that expresses 3 mRNAs that creates 3 T-cell engagers, which are of course secreted against BCMA, GPRC5D, and FCRH. I think if I recall correctly, all for B-cell in myeloma. I don't know what the side effect profile of this thing will look like, because each of those have got slightly different side effect profiles. So let's see where they go. The area that I thought would be interesting is if you could target these intracellularly. But then even there, I don't know, to intracellular targets, I still don't see how then you get the cell becoming a production factory leverage that you would get. In vivo CAR T makes a lot of sense. That is what LNPs are used a lot for at the minute, or there are two ways of doing it, LNPs and lentiviral. So if they can make it work, that's great. I think it's interesting. Last thing I would say on this is David Berman very interestingly kept repeating that we won't be putting an enormous amount of money in some of these things, some of the earlier stage antigen-based mRNAs, if the intismeran trial in melanoma doesn't work out, which of course he said he fully expects it to work out. Just last thing to say is that we have some worries about that trial reading out in the potential the second half of this year. Over.
Yeah, feels to some extent like when you're an mRNA hammer, everything looks like a nail, but the question is, which is the best fit for that hammer? Maybe we can go close out with a number of data updates. Tess, you're going to take us through, including exciting update for Definium, space that we've spent a lot of time on, the psychedelic space, as we watch the field of psychiatry really start to transform from kind of a chair and a couch type practice to interventional psych. You're also going to cover AbbVie. Between them and Veradermics, the hope is that maybe someday I'll have a great head of hair, just like the Veradermics CEO.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's take these through, pretty quickly. I think Moonlake, showed their drug sonolic. Oh my goodness. Sonelokimab in HS. So they shared, an update on that data. They had week 52 data from their trials Vela 1, Vela 2, and they reported for high score 75, 67.2 percent of patients reaching that at week 52, and we have about I think bimekizumab, which has really become one of the one of the important drugs in that space. I think is around 60%. I think they were also slightly higher on high score 100. I think this likely suggests that they have a drug that looks pretty similar to bimekizumab. They also looked at the safety profiles, and those were comparable. Those were comparable as well. So that BLA submission is on track for later this year, and we'll see what happens with the company. But moving forward with a drug that looks competitive relative to the lead therapy in HS. Not sure if there's any other comments on that one. Maybe moving on then to Merck. All we know is the trial was positive. Great news. So, they met their primary and secondary endpoints in ulcerative colitis. This is obviously a mechanism that we are all watching for, and we're looking forward to data in the fall on that. Josh, why don't you actually take Definium here, since you've been so close to that space.
Oh, sure. Positive phase 3 data for LSD in MDD, a very robust efficacy signal, and generally well tolerated, and looks like another psychedelic coming potentially to market for patients. I think one question we'll have to sort through is the FDA certainly seems amenable to approving psychedelic therapies for treatment-resistant depression. Are they ready to move to MDD? Although in the study there were a number of refractory patients as well. Certainly a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for this space, as noted. Psychiatry is changing in front of our eyes. It used to be that residency programs for psychiatry were nearly impossible to fill, and you'd almost take anyone with a pulse. From what I understand now, the residency programs in psychiatry, some of the most competitive to get into, and the psychedelic wave is a driving force behind that. Do you want to finish off on AbbVie?
Yeah, sure. So, what AbbVie was showing is they were showing an antibody they have that is a half-life extended antibody, targeting prolactin, that they're advancing, and they shared, data showing, showing some of the initial clinical. I think it was the SAD results, for this medicine, as well as a $100 million offering that they did with Eli Lilly, Adage, BVF, Columbia Threadneedle, Invus, Redmile. So certainly excitement around this, this drug. So PRLR. And they're focused on androgenic alopecia, so getting Josh, some more hair, and endometriosis. And I think an interesting point just to highlight on this one is this is actually an example of inspiration from China Biotech, right, where Hope Medicines, China Biotech has actually studied prolactin in endometriosis and in androgenic alopecia and shared some of those results. And AbbVie said, okay, cool. That's a really interesting finding. Let's, go forward with a program that they think can be really competitive there, where they've, really focused on optimizing that half-life so that Josh, you don't have to worry about taking, you don't have to worry about taking a pill every day.
Exactly.
So I think, we close on a great example of just how we can be inspired by innovation that happens in a lot of places and, work on improving it. And that can happen here just as much as it can happen in China.
My fingers are crossed. What a treat to be able to host a session with three of my favorite people, really, in all of Wall Street and biotech. Eric, Sam, Tess, thank you for your thoughtful commentary. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch up again soon.